Hello everybody. So this is going to be a very different sort of video series from me. I'm not going to be doing anything funny and I'm not going to be talking about anime in these videos. Rather, I'm going to be talking about something very close and important to me. And those who know me know that this is a big deal for me because I don't normally like talking about my real life in my YouTube videos. As a general rule of thumb, I normally try to keep my real life and online life separate from each other. Occasionally I'll bring up events that have happened to me only if they're necessary to explain lack of content, but most of the time I prefer to keep my private life, well, just that, private. But I'm going to be kind of bridging the gap between those two just a little bit for these videos. So I'm drawing a lot of inspiration from Little Karibo's We're Still Here series, which, if you haven't seen it, that's a series of video blogs like this where he talks about his journey with depression, and if you haven't seen it before, I honestly recommend watching it. Like, even if you don't suffer with depression, it's a very, very interesting series of videos. It's very heartfelt and it really gives you an insight as to what it's like living life as a person who suffers with depression. So yes, I am drawing inspiration from that, but mine's going to be slightly different in that I'm going to be talking about my journey as having Asperger syndrome. Now, a lot of my fans know that I have that syndrome, but there's plenty who don't. But yes, I have Asperger syndrome. If you don't know what that is, it's a form of autism, and yes, it is classified as a form of autism. I know there's plenty of people out there who don't believe that it is, but it is classed as a form of autism now. Now, it's a very low-end form of autism. It's very low on the autistic spectrum. As you can see, I'm very high functioning, so yes, it is very on the low end of the autistic spectrum, but it is still on the spectrum nonetheless. So yes, I'm going to be talking about my journey with Asperger's, as I have repeated a couple of times now, but I'm sorry, that's something I'm prone to do as having the syndrome. So if you have Asperger's syndrome, hopefully you will find the things I say in these videos beneficial. If you know somebody who does, hopefully you'll find that beneficial as well. And if not, if you're just curious about the syndrome in general and what it's like for somebody living with it, then you're welcome to watch. I can't guarantee you're going to like everything that I say or you're going to agree with everything I say, but I'm just going to give my personal perspective on what it's like having the syndrome and living with it. So I was diagnosed with the syndrome officially when I was 23 years old. I believe I mentioned having it a couple of times before then in videos, because I've been doing videos for a long time, longer than most people realise. Yeah, I had mentioned having it before then, but I never got an official diagnosis until I was 23 years old. So actually I was preaching that I had something, but I didn't actually know what it meant until then. The reason I was saying that is because my GP had said that it might be worth trying to get me diagnosed like years prior, and I won't bore you with all the details, but the diagnosis didn't actually happen until I was 23. But yes, I got my diagnosis when I was 23 years old, and you probably all thought I was about 23 years old because my baby face, but I'm 27 as of the time of this recording, so it's been a couple of years since I got my official diagnosis, and getting that diagnosis was a real eye-opener because it made me realise just how deep the syndrome actually runs in me, and like how many factors of my life were defined by that, like how many like different mannerisms and things I have like that were because of that. A lot of people think when somebody says like, oh well, I have Asperger's syndrome, that's why I do this, that's just an excuse, and to a point that can be true, and I'll get more into that a bit later, but I don't think a lot of people realise just how deep this thing actually runs in people. It does affect my life a heck of a lot more than even I realised up to that point. Now, most people who meet me for the first time, when I mention I have the syndrome, they're normally surprised by it, because, as you've probably noticed in my videos, I don't normally, it's not on the surface obvious that I have the syndrome, and that's because for those 23 years of my life up until I got my diagnosis, I've been pretty much raised as a neurotypical person, which is a word to describe somebody not on the autistic spectrum, although I prefer to use the abbreviation NT, which is what I'll be using henceforth. Yeah, I've been raised as an NT up to that point, so I had developed a lot of defense mechanisms, a lot of coping strategies, rather, for dealing with the... I don't want to say difficulties, but I prefer the term differences in living with Asperger syndrome. That's why it's not always obvious when you first see me that, you know, that I'm autistic. And that's something I do hope to talk more about if this series hopefully progresses, is some of the coping strategies that I put in place to help me function in an NT world. Because that's one thing I do see quite a bit, especially on the internet, is people who got their diagnosis very early on in life, something that didn't really happen to people around the time I was young, because it wasn't as widely diagnosed when I was a child as it is now. But I see plenty of people who got their diagnosis very early on in life, and so as such they got used to people having to make allowances for the differences in their behaviour as a child, and as such now they're older in life, expect people to make those allowances even now in the adult world, when actually in the adult world you need to come to a bit of a compromise, I find, which is why I think it's actually beneficial that I got my diagnosis so late on in life. Yes, this syndrome does have a lot of challenges that come with it, and there are certain things that the NT world will have to be a bit understanding with us with. I do accept that, but at the same time I find it does have to go the other way as well. I find a lot of Aspies do need to kind of be more understanding of the NT world, just as much as they expect the NT world to be understanding of their world, basically. Because the fact of the matter is there's over 6 billion people on this planet, so it's impossible to adhere to just one person's way of life, because if we did that, well, then none of us are going to be happy except for that one person. So I find life in general is a journey of compromise, whether you're Asperger's or higher on the spectrum or NT or otherwise. Life is a journey of compromise. I think it's very important to find a middle ground between the two, as in having NTs understand that somebody with Asperger's might perceive things differently to how you mean them, so you might need to give them a thorough explanation or something, or they might react to certain things differently to how an NT would. But at the same time, people with Asperger's understanding that NTs do also see the world differently to how they do, and how they might be meaning certain things differently to how you're perceiving them. So yes, finding that middle ground, which isn't always easy, I will admit, but that's, again, just true of life. Finding compromise isn't always an easy thing. In anything in life, compromise isn't always easy, like whether it's compromise between the Asperger's and NT world or otherwise. Compromise is something that can be difficult to find, so, you know, when I say these things, I don't say it in a holier-than-thou way, like, that, oh, I've been able to do this, that, or the other, so you should be able to as well, because achieving the things that I have did not happen overnight. It was a long, long journey, and it was not always an easy journey, so, you know, you're not going to find these middle grounds overnight. There's certain middle grounds that I'm still trying to find with people. I'm not going to drone on too much about this, because one thing I find people with Asperger's do, and I am guilty of this myself, is the droning on, is over-explaining things, because we don't always pick up on unspoken language. That is something I in particular really struggle with. So we tend to explain things at length, not realising that actually an NT has picked up on the subtle points of it, because we don't always get that ourselves. So I'm not... I say I'm not going to drone on, then I drone on about droning on, I'm sorry, about it for too long, because the irony of that is, I know people with Asperger's also find it hard to focus on something if it's something that drones on for too long, and it's not particularly catching their interest, so that's the irony of it all. But a couple of examples I can give is, one is that I don't particularly care for people touching me. That is something that does annoy me when people touch me, especially if it's from behind without me seeing. Like, that really freaks me out. I did used to scream or get freaked out more so by, but in my adult life it does make me jump, but I try to, like, I'm better now at bringing myself down after that initial shock. But in general, even if it's someone I can see going to touch me, I don't particularly like it. But at the same time, I've come to understand that that is something NTs just do as a sign of affection or support or whatnot. Sometimes it's something they do as reassurance, and so they don't mean any harm by it. So I try to remind myself of that if they are like touching me, like patting me on the shoulder or just telling me things are going to be alright. I'm like, right, they're doing that to tell me that they're doing it as an assurance, and it's as much a thing for them to feel like they're assuring me or doing something right by me. You know, it's as much for them as it is trying to help me. So I just tell myself that, okay, well, I don't like this, but it's something they're doing to reassure me. And if I need to cope with it afterwards, I quietly just, I try to think it, but sometimes the feelings are just so strong, but I just quietly say under my breath, please don't touch me. You know, to kind of get that out of my system, because you know, I know they don't normally mean any harm by it. So, but if you are an NT and you do know somebody with Asperger's who is adverse to touching, or you think they might be adverse to touching, it might be a good idea to just try asking them, is it okay if I touch you, or explaining that the reason why you're about to make contact with them. But at the same time, most of the time it is just for a reassurance or an affectionate thing. Another compromise I find goes back to what I was saying about not getting unspoken language. Because people with Asperger's don't, like I say, we don't pick up on the subtleties of things, we don't always get implications, and we don't always get body language. Body language is one that really freaks me out because it feels like people are reading my mind, and I can't do it to them. So yeah, we don't always pick up on subtleties, so don't ever be afraid to ask for more explanation with something, and don't even be afraid to say, look, I'm sorry, I have Asperger's, so I need you to make this as clear as possible to me. So don't be afraid to say that, to ask for more explanation with something. It's better that you get a full-on proper explanation than try and do something with only a vague understanding of it. And again, I think the crossroads to that would be for NTs, like, understand that when an Aspie asks that, well, it's only because they want to do it right. I know it can be a nuisance to have to explain something when you think you've already given a thorough explanation, but then to give it in even more detail than what you've already said, but it's because they don't want to let you down, and I am completely sympathetic as to why it's frustrating, but I think in the long run it will pay off for you to just give that extra bit of explanation. I'm going to leave this video off here, though I am going to revisit the topic of compromise later down the line. I really just want to use this video to give an introduction to what this series is going to be about and give an example of the things I'm going to talk about, but as I say, I will revisit this point, and I'll obviously go over other points as time goes on. But hopefully you did find this video beneficial. Maybe it gave you a better understanding about the condition, or maybe a better understanding about yourself if you have the condition, or maybe a better understanding about having to live in an NT world. But whatever the case, I hope you did find this video beneficial, and hopefully I can keep this going as time goes on and as my real life permits. We'll have to see how that goes, because as I mentioned in the recent Dragon Ball retrospective video, I have to schedule this a lot around my working schedule, but hopefully I can get more of these out before too long. So hopefully you found this video informative, and I hope to do more of these in the future. So I will see everybody later.